Okay, right. There we go. I think, Anders, can you say something just to double check that?
Okay, I can explain what I had for breakfast, which was blueberry juice and a sandwich.
Excellent. And yeah, so we were. Let's stop talking about black holes and proton decay, interesting as that is. Um, and yeah, so right. Happy Friday, everyone. It is my once again distinct pleasure to welcome Ruben, uh, Ruben Fellow of what are you fellow of now, Anders?
So I'm in the theme of artificial intelligence and machine learning at Reuben College.
Awesome. So New Ruben College is a new college at Oxford. Anders is senior research fellow at the Future of Humanity Institute, which is um, one of the most interesting research groups in the world, and whether or not you guys like achieve anything in the long term is very cool. And I think you have probably a greater than 1% chance of saving the world, potentially the universe. So, you know, at very least, it's cool work, and on the upper end of value, potentially, you know, the most important work that's ever done.
Ah, thank you.
Um, but today we're talking about, rather than directly kind of saving the world or colonizing the universe or any of those sort of things, we're talking about furries, otherkin, and kind of the general idea of radical redefinition of the physical basis of one's kind of identity. Um, so I guess to start off, um, what's your persona?
Yeah, I was struggling with this question for quite a while. And then one day I realized actually it's a utility fog. It's a lot of little nanomachines linked up through air. And well, it's not so much a persona as something else. I don't even know what the term for that is.
Yeah, so I gave it a little thought, and in terms of kind of traditional persona things, I guess maybe a lizard or something, because I like warm temperatures. I don't like having to move very much, and I have a very simple brain in comparison to what might be achieved with neurotechnology. But sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting thing. When I was trying to figure out a persona, I was trying to look at what traits do I have, what does it fit in with, and I don't know when you were thinking about lizard if you did the same process.
Yeah, I think I tried to come up with some of the traits that I have that at least kind of indirectly map on to animal or not necessarily animal. I guess we should probably start off with kind of trying to define um, furries and otherkin a little bit. And so personally, I wouldn't say I'm a furry, though I would say that I'm sympathetic to their kind of cause. And part of the reason why I want to do this is I think they get shit on a lot online, and I think it's generally worth like championing the cause of, you know, people who get a bit downtrodden. But also it's such an interesting sort of divergence from the norm. Um, so where do you think it fits in with like maybe comparable or potentially comparable sort of desires to change one's identity, like transgenderism, transracialism, these kind of ideas?
So it's worth noticing that many people who are drawn to furries, first of all, they might not even have a persona themselves. They might just like the idea of anthropomorphic animals, and whether that is from Disney cartoons or creating art of it. But quite a lot of people in the furry community, of course, have at least one, quite often several personas. And then you have other kin who actually say, actually, I am a lizard in a human body, or I am really alive. And of course, this might become arbitrarily weird. I sometimes wonder, maybe I'm actually a planetary Jupiter mind who's unfortunately been crammed into this squishy meat body, but one day I'll regain my planetary size and splendor. On other days, I realize, actually, is that what I really feel? So I think there is something very interesting here that we should be discussing, both how we build personas and stories about animals and how we project things onto this human animal hybrid spectrum, as well as the really cool question, what does it actually mean to say, oh, I'm actually a dragon in a human body? Or for that matter, I'm a woman in a man's body, or I'm a Norwegian in a Swede's body. Where does these claims fit in? And some of them are probably deserving of important respects, and we need to do some sort of thing. In other cases, we might actually say, okay, that's just a plain weird thing to believe in.
Mm.
So there's quite a lot of juicy ethical questions, neurological questions, psychological questions, not to mention social questions here.
So what do you think it means when someone someone claims, I am in some literal sense a dragon or a wolf or whatever?
So a lot of this has to do with how we construct our identities. So I personally don't think there is a truth to the matter what personal identity is. There are some people who totally disagree, including some of my colleagues in the philosophy department. But a fairly popular view around Oxford, because of the philosopher Derek Parfit, is that actually there is no real such thing as Anders in a sense. I'm just a sequence of mental states. I remember my past mental states and I project who I am in the future. But this is relatively arbitrary. And Derek did a lot of amazingly fun science fiction thought experiments in his famous book, Reasons and Persons, where he had his teletransporter that, like the Star
Mm.
Trek transporter, was scanning you, picking you apart atom by atom, and reassembling atoms on Mars. And through these thought experiments, he kind of undermined the idea that there was actually anything essential about that identity. But you could still make a good argument that I remember when I was a child. Indeed, I'm sitting now in a room where I remember playing as a kid, and I have a link to this room. Except, of course, that kid, very few of the atoms in that kid's body are present in the room right now. My memories are probably totally distorted. Indeed, I made up a story about who I am over time. We have these narrative stories, which are really essential for who we think we are. So I might tell you the story about me being an academic and bolstering it by pointing at my bookshelf with a lot of heavy books and telling you some amusing anecdotes from my childhood about getting interested in science. But of course, in a different context, I might be arguing about other things. Now, getting over to the real topic here, that story about who I am might not just be the standard part of what profession I have or why I have my beliefs. It might be also beliefs about my body. Do I regard myself as a strong person? Well, I have a lot of objective evidence against it, but I could make an argument that I'm strong. I might even imagine that, although it would be a slightly false belief. And I can make it true, of course, by going to the gym, heaven forbid. Now, the interesting part is, of course, that some of the aspects of our minds are kind of more arbitrary. Do I regard myself as a creative person? Well, that's, again, much less objective. And many of the more subtle aspects of who I truly am are completely narrative, which means that we could totally make an argument that maybe my narrative is that I'm a dragon. Now, there is something else here, though, because my body image is, of course, an interplay between my mind and my body. And indeed, there is a map up in my cortex that represents my tactile sensations, and there are maps for motor control, and they get updated by interaction between my body and the environment and my intention. So one interesting thing is that sometimes these mental maps of the body don't correspond to the actual body. The most famous example is, of course, phantom limbs. So if my arm gets cut off, the sensory cortex handling my arm, well, it doesn't get any signals. It probably starts tuning things up and starts hallucinating its experience from my arm, which might be very painful and very hard to get rid of. because there is no painkiller that works for a non-existent arm. Similarly, there have been arguments that people who are transsexual also have body images in the brain, but actually don't quite conform to their physical body. So you could imagine that maybe you could actually have a literal dragon body map, although I think that is relatively unlikely. But that's, of course, just the first order body map. We also have a concept about the body. Many people believe there are spirits trapped in flesh, after all.
So I think it is something worth emphasizing that when we're talking about kind of other forms of like trans identity, such as trans speciesism we're kind of discussing here, the level of evidence and the level of our understanding about it is far inferior to something like transgenderism, where we have like a very large body of evidence about what are effective treatments and effective interventions for improving trans people's lives. We have a lot of narrative evidence and media evidence of people discussing their experiences and so forth. So we can actually empirically verify the ways of improving their outcomes. Um, we don't have that kind of body of evidence yet, maybe with things like otherkin, where there does seem to be, as you say, that kind of similarity in claim of I believe that my identity, my experience maps onto something that is not adequately represented by my sort of physical existence. Um, but there does seem to be a fairly big distinction nonetheless between um, claiming an identity that's sort of physically possible within human experience. You believing that you're a true Brit as opposed to a Swede. There are humans who are Brits, I believe, just as there are humans who are Swedes. If you believe that you are actually Anna Sandberg instead of Anders, there are plenty of female people, so that's not as big a leap. Whereas if you are, Anders the utility fog or Anders the dragon, uh, these are, I've never seen utility fog, I've never seen a dragon. So how should we kind of treat these claims that are uh, beyond human experience? Even things like a wolf, I might have seen a wolf, but I've never seen a person who is a wolf in any kind of physical sense.
So I think it also links into this discussion about the psychology of religion, actually. When you think about many of the claims for the supernatural events that you find in religions, they actually form fairly reliable structures. Gods might have animal attributes, but they extremely rarely have plant attributes. You find lots of Egyptian gods with animal heads, but none of them with sunflowers, which, when you start looking into it, you realize that actually there is a structure to what we can believe in when it comes to religions. Basically, some things you break the normal rules of how everyday reality works because it's supposed to be mysterious and divine and different, but you can't break it too much. You can't actually have a god who has the number 5 for a head, at least outside a new weird fantasy novel or something like that, that deliberately wants to push things. A god with a jackal head, on the other hand, oh, that's fairly everyday. A bearded god sitting on a cloud sending lightning at atheists. Yeah, that's very, very easy to understand. It's outside our normal experience, but it takes elements of our experience, like being angry or throwing things, and scales them up. And I think the same thing might be happening here. So well, a lot of people say, oh, I'm actually pure spirit trapped in a fleshy body. In some sense, they're making a claim to be a kind of otherkin, a kind of gnostic otherkin. And to some extent, we're even basing that on this experience that I want to do certain things like stay healthy. And then some part of me really wants to eat a lot of chocolate, even though that's unhealthy. And I ought to exercise, but for some reason I don't do that. So I can ascribe this by saying, those dirty impulses, they're part of my fallen material body, but all my nice, fine impulses, they coming from the spiritual thing. And then I become a dualist and then they go to the theology department and write papers about how it works. But deep down, it's really a way of explaining experiences. And we can attribute things like that. So again, I have no idea what it's like to be a cat. And of course, Nagel famously wrote What It's Like to Be a Bat, where he made a very eloquent argument that it's extremely hard for us to imagine the sensory world of a bat. But cats are a little bit closer to us. We interact with them. In many ways, we have bred them to be a little bit more human like. Dogs are even more extreme. They even have an extra muscle so we can
Indeed,
do
yeah.
puppy eyes at us.
Around the is it actually the orbicularis oculi? It's an accessory muscle to the orbicularis, I think. But
Cool.
yeah, they're capable of engaging in far more expressive eye movements than wolves are, despite being technically the same species.
Yeah. And the funny thing is, of course, we have domesticated them, but to some extent, we have also domesticated ourselves. There are signs that the domestication syndrome that you see in many mammals when we domesticate them, like becoming more neotenous, more expressive, faces that are bigger eyes and smaller, being more sociable, etc., also happens in humans. We might be turning a lot of other species into creatures a bit more like us, but we are also turning ourselves into a kind of caricature of ourselves. If this goes on, we might all end up looking like anime characters.
I wouldn't be surprised. Um, and actually, that kind of does raise an interesting issue between uh, the connection between this kind of internal narrative that you're talking about, um, and our physical experience. So you mentioned the what it's like to be a bat. Um, I think I have less difficulty than most imagining what it's like to be a bat, in part because I have a magnet implanted in my finger, which has given me, in a very limited sense, an ability to interact physically with electromagnetic fields, to feel the extent of them and the intensity of them, and to it in a very real sense, mapped on, and if you stuck me in an MRI, you could demonstrate this. I mean, well, if you stuck 100 of me in in 100 MRIs and did the appropriate statistical analysis, you could almost certainly find out that some very small part of my somatosensory, so my like touch sensation, um, has mapped on to my uh, or has changed in my brain in a way that it represents other sensory experiences. And a similar thing is probably happening in bats' brains compared to more visually focused mammals. In that, and some humans are capable of this with extreme vision loss, of mapping on soundscapes into a kind of visual analogy. Indeed, bats have more of their brain dedicated to more of the parts of their brain that are typically involved with like spatial reasoning, uh, directly connected to the auditory sensory paths than the visual ones. Um, so is there a possibility, as it's my roundabout way of getting to, is there a possibility, do you think, as both a philosopher and a neuroscientist, um, of altering our brains in such a way that it changes our perception of our own species, gender, whatever?
I would totally agree. And the easiest way is, of course,
Mm.
probably to change our bodies. I remember one paper where they extended the whiskers of lab rats so they became much longer. It's fairly well known that if you're cruel and cut off the whiskers of a cat, it will quite often get stuck because it uses the whiskers to figure out the size of an opening and whether it can get its body through. Apparently, the same thing is true for the rats, but now they were feeling like they're much bigger. So they change the body shape. And we, of course, change our mental body image even just by holding a tool. Now, if I were to permanently add something like an extra thumb, there was another interesting paper doing that. Um, so you could control the thumb in some clever way. I didn't remember how it did, but you had an extra thumb strapped on your hand, and it did indeed change that representation. So these representation can be changed, and you could. The most obvious thing is go to a virtual reality and try to be a different gender or a different species. You might still need a lot of feedback to do that remapping. Some of it is probably near instant. If I pick up a long rod or the broadsword my mother has standing in the corner here, don't ask why, suddenly my sense of egocentric space will change. I will extend the volume of space where I'm using myself as the coordinate system rather than the allocentric space outside, which is kind of more neutral north-south coordinate system. When I drop the sword, uh, suddenly that changes back. But if I were to constantly keep tools, so constantly walk on stilts, I would probably change my body image accordingly. Some of this probably fits with the affordances of our brain much better than others. It wouldn't surprise me at all if adding whiskers, for example, rather rapidly adapted, because I'm coming from a whiskey bearing set of mammals. After all, a few million years ago, we all had whiskers, which means that there probably a little bit of circuitry and structure that can be awoken in that case. Adding, let's say, octopus tentacles, on the other hand, is going to be way harder to achieve. But I do think that adding stuff to the body is an obvious low hanging fruit. Virtual reality seems to work for some things, but not others. And we can learn quite a bit, I think, from figuring out what works easily and what doesn't work.
That's a fascinating idea, the concept of kind of experimental identity hacking. Um, and that actually brings me on quite nicely to so there's this sort of anarcho-capitalist meme of or sort of libertarian kind of idea of what happens to society if we lower the cost of moving house or moving country or whatever to so low that people can basically like vote with their feet and go to whatever polity they want and and that's interesting thought experiment, but um, in politics. But I think it's even more interesting to ask what's the consequence of lowering the cost of changing our identity uh, very, very low, so that we could, obviously at the moment for transgender people going through the whole process of transitioning from one gender to another and being accepted by society and potentially going through surgical treatments and hormones and so on and so forth is a massive pain in the ass to say the least. Um, but if it were as simple as taking a pill and waiting a week, um, or if we were able to grow whiskers, get whisker implants with a day surgery, or visit um, new bodies through virtual reality worlds. What sort of consequences would you speculate that would have on society and on us individually?
So one interesting thing is that we tend to protect our identities. One of my favorite papers about the ethics of enhancement is recent Simon's paper about fundamentalness of traits to your sense of self and your willingness to enhance them. I think I might have mentioned it in your podcast before, but
Mm.
it's a really nice little survey. They looked at various possible things to enhance and asked how fundamental is this to your sense of self, and would you like a pill to fix it? And more than half of the students asked wanted things that improved rote memory and attention and alertness, and only 9% wanted a kindness enhancing pill. And the anti correlation was pretty nice. The more fundamental something feels to yourself, the less willing you are to enhance it, even though I think we all ought to try to become more kind. But most of us probably think we're kind enough. It's everybody else who ought to be kinder. Now, turning this over to morphological freedom, it might very well be that the the people who really don't feel at home in the bodies, who really feel a lack of tail or whiskers, they would, of course, really want to do this directly. Most people would probably not want to do it if it felt it changed their identity. So you might very well get people doing this for a masquerade, but it's not really an exploration. It's a little bit like a question I got about sexual preference. What if it was a pill? Wouldn't I want to try a pill to try out being a hetero for a while? And I felt, oh, actually, I don't, which was very interesting because normally I'm all in favor of trying out weird new experiences, but for some reason I didn't want to have that pill, which told me something about this apparently is part of my self construction, my narrative of who or what I am. And that might, of course, change if it actually was really easy and safe and all the cool people are doing it. Because that's another important part. What changes make sense are very strongly affected by what society does. But one reason why it's so hard to do transitioning gender wise today is, of course, not just that surgery and hormones are nasty, but also, conforming to societal expectations is a real nightmare. And if we look at people experimenting with identity as teenagers and young adults, again, you find that many of them are not that wild. They tend to conform to various subgroups. Well, in the 90s, we were all joking, but all the individualistic goths were all very, very identical. And different subgroups evolve, and they all, because they want to be individuals and rebel against society, look surprisingly similar to each other because you at least want to have your own group. So I think that in a world where it was trivial to change your body, you're going to find that quite a lot of people are going to change their body surprisingly little.
I think that's an interesting point. Um, and I don't know. I expect we would see a lot of people not doing much, and some people going, to use your kind of goth analogy of, extreme change, but still within a limited social group or within a kind of in group. Um, I think we would definitely see some people going pretty radical. I know that, so for viewers who aren't familiar, there's an excellent role-playing game, tabletop role-playing game called Eclipse Phase, which Anders, I believe you contributed to the book.
A little bit. I think I've quoted in a place or two, and I certainly have been promoting it everywhere I can.
Well, good show
It's
because
a really excellent setting.
yeah, it's fantastic, and without going into too much detail, it's a sort of reasonably near future sci-fi setting, um, but where there is very radical morphological freedom. Um, well, not everywhere. Jupiter isn't big on morphological freedom, but the setting more broadly has radical morphological freedom, and some people indeed transfer their consciousness into things such as gigantic whale-like creatures that live in the outer reaches of the sun, um, which sounds like a fascinating experience.
It's probably worth trying at least once.
Yeah, and I would certainly like to see that kind of weird stuff occur, though a lot of people I think get quite concerned and in the same sort of conservative reaction of, what if we have the gays teaching the kids, won't they want to turn all the kids into, having sex with animals or something? Well, what if we, have otherkin around? Won't they want to teach people this other moral degeneracy? And there's always that kind of moral panic, but um, it does seem like maybe in the case of transitioning portions of our species into very radically different forms, maybe there's cause to be a bit reserved about that. What kind of risks do you think might occur from such a societal shift, and do you think that they're worth being seriously concerned about?
So I think there is a spectrum of issues. So one that you brought up is kind of the moral panic. And it's actually worth being concerned about it because we need to work on better ways of building up toleration. Uh, we're living in an increasingly globalized world. We need to be able to get along with people who have really different cultures. That's already tough. And there is probably going to be other aspects of lifestyle that we need to actually be able to handle. That includes having neighbors who might not regard themselves as quite the same species as ourselves. If we can't do that toleration, we're going to end up in a lot of conflicts. But there is also this more tricky issue about, well, what values do certain enhancement and morphological changes embody? So there is a reason why you have this current uproar about trans rights, because they do actually challenge gender identity in a very profound way. And identity, after all, is something we are all always building. It's important to us. And I quite often mention that when I bring up life extension, many people get very upset because, of course, finding a way of handling your identity as a mortal being and coming to terms with that, that's important to you. And then this weird transhuman shows up and starts kicking at the foundation, saying, well, actually, we might be able to fix this. That is a threat to that identity. And same thing, of course, for gender. Actually questioning what does it mean to be a man or a woman, that is fairly tricky emotionally for most people. You also get it into the even wider complications about feminism. What does feminism mean if people can change genders willy-nilly? So there is a lot of different takes on that within the feminist community, and that again leads to a lot of perhaps more heat than light in many of the conversations. So now, if we could modify a species belonging, the obvious thing is, what does it mean to be a human? You can say, well, let's stretch this and say we're all transhumans here. But even that is going to be relatively tricky because what traits do make me a human if I can modify everything?
Hmm.
Sorry, so
Sorry,
we
no worries.
might say, sorry,
Oh, just gonna say, don't worry.
yeah. So one interesting example might be compassion. I think compassion is an admirable, important trait, and it's actually part of a set of traits that makes it reasonable to say that humans are like that. You could imagine an enhancement or maybe a disenhancement that removed compassion. You would be very rational, but you might be essentially a sociopath. Most people say, yeah, that's not a very good thing. I definitely don't want to have that guy as my neighbor or my, even worse, my boss. It might be that that kind of modification is kind of putting you outside a community we have. Now, having scales on the other hand, well, does scales mean that you're outside the community? And some people would say that. But I think most of us would say, no, it's what's on the inside that counts. So you're still a compassionate lizard. That's not a problem. So I think drawing the boundaries about what's truly human, this has been, of course, a long-running issue in culture and philosophy, and it gets even more relevant when we can start modifying ourselves. Many of the modifications probably don't matter that much from this perspective. Having a tail, yeah, we are not defined as being tailless, really. Greek
Aristotle might
philosopher,
disagree.
some would, but you have this famous discussion about Aristotle defining humans as a featherless biped, and then somebody gave him a plucked chicken and said, "Behold the human." But in a sense, nobody's really upset about that chicken because that's not threatening our humanity. I think some people will, of course, always be upset whatever you do. So if somebody shows up with a wolf head, they are going to be terribly annoyed by that. I think the more deep reason to be annoyed is, oh, interpreting facial expressions in a wolf might actually be quite hard. We might actually have a communication problem that's actually significant. Then again, if you look at anthropomorphic pictures, you actually find that they are not having actual animal faces. They have something in between, and we might very well engineer ways of expressing the facial expressions and deal with that. But you are going to have this debate about where do we draw the lines about human, saying that it has something to do with the body, or saying that it has to do something with our traits and minds. Mm, whatever you do, some people are going to feel like you did something very bad over there. And then, of course, there is the overall question: should we even be one species? Maybe we should say, actually, we're a family of species
Mm.
and some machines and some other entities. Those people who manage to upload themselves into bioengineered plants, okay, they're part of this big, weird family. But we might extend and say, yeah, as long as you're a rational, sentient being, except that we are probably going to have to work rather hard on our toleration to get to that state. I think also there are fundamental issues here about there might be people wanting to branch off in directions that are downright disturbing. What if you actually want to create a hive mind subspecies? After all, there are mammals that are essentially eusocial, like the naked mole rats. If you could imagine naked mole rats humans, that's a yucky and disturbing thought, but I think biologically plausible. And given that I can think it, there's probably some philosopher out there thinking that's actually a good thing to do.
You can find a philosopher who will try to justify anything.
Yeah,
Um, but yeah, I think it gets to be a very difficult line to draw. And one of the commenters here, Elysium, says, "How do you define human once you get this far into body mods?" And that's kind of the fundamental question. And even whether um, human is a meaningful distinction here, whether we want to kind of just drop um, human as the like normatively valuable thing that we're shooting for, and if we just want to go for, as you say, like rational and sentient as kind of baselines, um, but to some degree we may have to um, kind of set a limit to our um, the sphere of our like moral value, because if we extend it too far, then we're caring about all kinds of things that maybe we probably shouldn't value, like going into kind of panpsychism with worrying about the feelings of rocks. Um, there does seem to be probably some limit we should put. Uh, but to my understanding at least, we seem to be quite far away from engineering ourselves into that thing. As you say, like adding a tail, it doesn't actually change you that much. Making you into an unfeeling, uncaring sociopath, that's maybe a bit more substantial, even if it's not creating an outward appearance of change.
and I like to point out that sociopaths are people too. It's just
Absolutely.
that most of us get creeped out by that, even that concept. Because when we talk about neurodiversity, we tend to think about those forms of neurodiversity that have good press, that are like the people we end up meeting on the internet all the time. And then we notice that sociopaths, there seem to be something about the moral character of somebody who haven't got a conscience, and that is worrisome. But I think we should actually realize that, yeah, they actually got human rights too. It's just that we might want to watch ourselves a little bit around them.
Mm.
And indeed, there are high functioning sociopaths who realize that actually breaking all the rules, I don't care, but everybody else cares. So it's kind of risky for me to show that I don't care too much. So let's just follow the rules because that saves me so much effort.
Yeah, this is often something I've wondered about, is what proportion of people are fundamentally lacking some aspect of human experience that most people take for granted, and how much that actually impacts their. You often, as Neon Golden points out here, sociopath is just such a messy term, but we're talking sort of generally about people lacking like empathy or whatnot, and um, I often read about people who lack the ability to imagine images, for example, or who just, well, we often talk about like the hedonic baseline, and I think it's fair to say that your hedonic baseline is very high, mine is quite low. Um, but these are aspects of our experience that until we get into quite radical, neuroengineering or at least pharmacology, neither of us will really know what it's like to experience that life with that kind of set point. And obviously, we don't ascribe moral value to that as much as with empathy, but nonetheless, it's quite a substantial part of each of our experiences. Um, and it, Golden saying it amazed me the other day to find out that not everyone experiences all of their inner thoughts and inner voice. And yeah, just things like this about our internal life that differ so much that it almost sometimes seems to me a bit silly to be arguing over, um, you know, whether it's okay for people to feel like X gender when like gender is obviously a big part of our experience, but things like happiness and memory and imagination on a day to day, like minute to minute basis, these seem like much bigger parts of our conscious lives that don't as nearly as much form the basis for tribalism and political disagreements and so forth. Um,
Partially, it might be that the colorblind don't really feel the need to have a strong voice,
mm,
except maybe in user interface design, where they actually have a good reason
mm.
to demand that we make interfaces that make sense to them. But the people who don't have a visual internal imagination, what what should they congregate about? But you could, in theory, imagine a future where we can scan the people and see what category they belong to. And of course, people can always say, "Yeah, that category is the good one, and that's the bad one," and now we can form tribes about it. But that, of course, has to do more with human sociability, which again has a lot of variation. And many autists, for example, they don't follow the sociability that well. And I've been thinking about in my own work, what if we could remove the rewarding experience of getting high social status? It seems to be intrinsically rewarding to humans to be a high social status. Some people who get a bigger reward than others, and they tend to be a bit careerist and want to get to the top. But if we modify it so you actually don't care about your social status, that would produce a very, very different society. You could still argue that, yeah, that's kind of human, except that we're exceedingly humble. They would be very noticeably different. I think most of us would say, yeah, that's kind of a nice, except that maybe I shouldn't do that upgrade.
And that kind of does raise the interesting possibility of this very fragmented society developing with the orbital habitat where nobody believes in kindness, the orbital habitat where nobody believes in social status, and I find that if slightly potentially concerning, at the very least exciting and cool.
Yeah, and I think this is a good way of doing a thought experiment about what it means to be human. It's also noticed that it's easy to imagine these groups of people that lack some capacity we have. It's much harder to add something entirely different because we can't imagine that. We all have a blind spot. It's a
Mm.
bit like me. I can't actually feel magnetic fields. So I'm missing out on this big sector of the universe that you actually have access to.
Yeah, and I've always found that a fascinating idea, the idea of expanding our awareness and our range of experiences. And I guess that's part of the reason why I've always been somewhat sympathetic to, furries and otherkin and so forth, because like if that's an area of experience you want to explore, like it seems pretty reasonable, and as long as one isn't making like firm claims about outside reality that have meaningful negative impacts on the world, it seems like a pretty reasonable thing to want to explore without being interfered with.
So now I think this is getting very close to Nick Bostrom's argument for transhumanism,
Mm,
where he said it's all about the freedom to explore the post-human realm. Just like there are enormously good states you can be in as a human, there is probably really, really good post-human states. So we should be searching through this big, vast space and trying to find them. And if we find some really good ones, then we might want to acquire them. But I think this is not all the reason you might want to be a different species, because it might also be that, yeah, it's about building my identity. If you look at people in the body modification community,
Mm.
many of them say, yeah, I do this in order to become more of myself, even if that means a grandiose set of tattoos and sharpened teeth or a split tongue. That is becoming more of oneself. And it's very subtle. It's not necessarily that, yeah, I have an image that I want to conform to. It might also be that I'm creating an image because I'm modifying my body. It's an interplay between my my actual body, possible imaginations, and then my response to that. So it's kind of a spiritual journey. So I think we have a lot of very different reasons to explore this place, and some people are going to be rather timid about it, probably rather justly, because you don't want to take too much risk with your body. It's currently the only thing we have. You might not want to risk your identity too much. But others, of course, much more willing to explore. And we should be very thankful for the people who are really willing to go far out there and try to see what happens if I do this. And then the rest of us can be watching from afar and say, oh, that seems interesting, or let's not do that ever again.
And I guess the only thing one really wants to avoid there is outcomes that lead to irretrievable bad states. Um, so while we might want to be cool with people, being a cat for a week, or being an otter for a lifetime, or whatever, um, we probably don't want people uh, accidentally or deliberately engineering themselves into um, uh, oh, bloody hell, the Dyson probes, not Dyson probes,
For Neumann probes,
Neumann probes. That's it, von Neumann probes. Thank you. Um,
self-replicating
yeah,
interstellar machines.
yeah. So we don't want to allow them to shift their physical identity into self-replicating machines that take over the universe.
Speak
Um,
for yourself.
well, as long as they turn it into headronium, that's going to be all right. But and I suppose
But I think, yeah, I see your point.
mm,
There is probably two or three different ways you might say, nope, we're not going to allow you to do that. One is, okay, going off and spamming the universe with copies of yourself. That's going to cut into the fun for the rest of us. So there is something about interfering with the rights of others, or the openness of the future. Then you could imagine taking the sociopathy implant, and now you don't care about compassion anymore. So you think, yeah, this is the greatest thing ever. Actually, when looking at it from your previous perspective, you might say, actually, that life is really dreadful, and but I can't even recognize it when I have that mental state. There are probably traps like that. Some of them very obvious, like if I'm just sitting in a corner drooling out of sheer bliss. Okay, I don't want to change anything, but it might still be a fairly pointless life. There is an interesting debate to be had, maybe in a different podcast, about how much happiness do we want?
mm,
How much wireheading should we have? But I think there is also this thing that you do certain changes that change you permanently, even if you go back to normal. So if I have been in a traumatic experience, that's going to affect how I watch other things. Even if I'm not really suffering from PTSD, just having had that experience has permanently changed me. And this is the trickiest form, because there's some experience that might be rather horrendous, but still might enrich a life. But the same experience might crush another person. It's not at all obvious which of these experiences are bearable or not.
yeah, and I suppose without some degree of experimentation, we're not going to find out which is which.
Yeah, to some extent, we know this from past experience with humans.
Mm.
Certainly, there is an enormous range. There are some people who have horrible childhoods, and then they just grow up and become totally well adjusted. And there are other people who have one bad day and then they go totally nuts. Uh, so we still have an understanding because, well, we're all human. The human range is a somewhat known factor. Now, if we start expanding that, that also means that there are parts here in the expanded space where we actually don't really know reliably how things are going to go. We could, of course, just wait around and do it this very, very slowly and carefully, and over millennia acquire experience of, yeah, this is what you can handle, and this is unlikely to be good for you. But well, that might be too slow. It might be that we actually will in the near future expand our capacities much faster than we can acquire knowledge about. So in some sense, we will know that we are not going to have that much wisdom about these things.
And that's always a an interesting but dangerous situation to be in, where our capability exceeds our wisdom in a given technological field.
And in many cases, the only way of learning the really non-trivial things is actually to do the bad things, to actually discover for yourself what works and what doesn't work, because you can't figure it out from the start. We can do a lot of figuring out from the start in domains that are very well behaved. There are some parts of physics and engineering and astronomy where we can just sit down and solve equations and make fairly accurate predictions of what's going to happen. But in most truly human things, the complexity is enormous. Each individual is an unknown continent full with totally unknown species of thoughts and ideas and behaviors, and that goes for all 7.3 billion of us. So in that case, we will have to try things and learn from things, which suggests that we might want to set up a system where people should be encouraged and allowed to explore, but we should also be trying to document as much as we can from how this goes. And then we bring that back to the mainstream, and hopefully we, after a while, we start noticing that actually getting extra senses seem to be just safe and nice, doesn't cause any trouble. Modifying your fear system to be fearless or more fearful, oh, that turns out to be surprisingly risky and problematic, and so on. We might start building this. But it might turn out to be just this grand project, just as complex as our current attempts at describing the human condition, which has been kind of ongoing for a few thousand of years among artists and philosophers and scientists. But, well, the transhuman condition is going to take us millennia or even longer to get a sense of.
Well, that sounds quite exciting to me.
Yeah, and I think as long as we can try to be compassionate and keep the downsides to a minimum by being careful, by having safeguards, by having enhancement buddies telling you, look, I don't think this enhancer is doing it for you. You're actually turning into a total jerk when you modify your emotional system like that. Or having ways of treating enhancement gone badly in weird ways and recognizing that, yeah, that's costing the taxpayers a bit of money, but in return, we're learning important things about the human condition. It's a little bit like our performance artists doing very wild and sometimes rather dangerous stuff. They are finding a form of information in form of artistic creation and telling us interesting things. So it's enriching our civilization, even though they might also harm themselves sometimes.
I think that's a really excellent analogy, um, and one that applies to a variety of other activities that we recognise to be potentially physically harmful, like extreme athletic performance. We like when person runs fast, even though person is, busting up their knees for the rest of their life. Um, but as a society, we generally sort of support, or David Blaine, someone brings up in chat, uh, doing risky things because it's in some way, perhaps not enlightening, but at least enhances the rest of society. And yeah, I like the idea of otherkin as sort of experiential pioneers who are um, messing around with personality. I say messing around. I don't want to be dismissive, but who are exploring new areas of personality and identity in order to bring back interesting bits of knowledge for the rest of us.
Yeah, yeah. I think one of the best things with our current civilization is that it actually recognizes that it can be wrong. Uh, Other exotic things, things from other civilization, can actually have value. we don't have all the answers, but we need to test things to figure out. Most civilizations throughout humanity's history have been fairly confident that we are the center of the world, we know what's right, and that's it. One of the best things about current Western civilization, I think, if we would narrow it down, but I think it's a bigger meta civilization, is this idea wait a minute, the weirdos might have a point sometimes. Most of the time, no. But sometimes we do discover something amazing.
Yeah, whenever that quote's brought up, first they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win, that thing. Um, I always think that smacks of survivorship bias because yes, that happens to everyone who wins, but it also happens to a very large number of people who don't win because their idea was crap and it deserved to be laughed at or fought or whatever. Um, but we've still got to have those all of that laughing and all of that fighting in order to get some winners. And you're absolutely right. That is something that I think kind of liberal Western society, however we want to categorize it, does quite well, which is accept that there's going to be a lot of weirdos doing things that maybe we wouldn't do ourselves, um, but that nonetheless, one time out of 100 turns out to be the thing that vastly improves society for centuries to come. And because it's so hard to predict what that one time is going to be, we should probably, let people do their weird thing without being too mean to them.
And even the things that don't turn out to be earth shattering, it's just a weird thing. It's still enriching us in various ways. If you
Absolutely.
look at various past art movements, I'm not a fan of Dadaism, but I'm very happy Dadaism happened, that it existed, and in some sense exists up in the art books because it contributed a bit to our understanding of the world, or at least it made the world slightly more rich and weird. And I think a world where it would be easy to change your bodily shape to fit your true self or what you want to project today, or just to do an exploration is a much better world because we learn much more about it. We tend to be rather impressed by how smart we are, but in practice, of course, we don't predict the future very well at all. We need to test things and experience it.
I think that's. Uh, I think you're absolutely right. Obviously, I'm horrendously biased in these matters, but yeah. Um, Before we completely wrap up, chat, if you've got any questions you would like to ask Dr. Sandberg while he's here, please do type them out. I see there's been a whole conversation going on while we've been having our conversation that's gotten quite interesting, but I haven't been able to pay full attention to it. Um, but yeah, so last thing, let me bring up my. So I guess to kind of wrap up our portion of the conversation, what's your prescription? What should we do? Because currently, there's a lot of controversy online about whether being otherkin is cringe and whether it's just, just a phase, or whether it's something like at all worth uh, taking seriously. What's your prescription for what to do about the furries, the otherkin, all of these weirdos changing up their identity and making all of these claims?
Generally, I'm of course very much of a Western liberal. We should be very tolerant to other people as long as they're tolerant to us. And we should try to expand this plateau of tolerance as far as we can humanely do that. But I think I'm of course always in favor of arguing in favor of morphological freedom. You could take the rights perspective and say we have a right to our own bodies, we have a right to our life, we have a right to decide for ourselves what to do, and from that it follows that we have a right to modify our bodies to fit what we want, what the kind of life we want to live. And normally, of course, I would argue this in terms of standard human enhancement, but it of course goes even more for modifying oneself to be a different species. And I think there are interesting practical questions of course, like is this just a negative right that nobody has a right to interfere with you, but they don't need to support you. Or as some disability activists have argued, no, you actually need to make some of this morphological freedom a positive right. We actually need to get access to that through the healthcare system. Otherwise, it's unfair. I'm kind of a little bit too libertarian to fully stand by that, but it's a stronger position than mine. And I find it an interesting thing to consider that maybe in the long run, the national healthcare system should have a species transition surgery as part of what it can do. But right now, what we can do, I think, is recognize that, yeah, we have a right to be different. It can be really useful to be different, but it also means that I'm going to cause reactions by being a particular way, and I can't actually prescribe how people should react to me. That's going something that's going to emerge from the interaction. After all, if I have a freedom of expression, that doesn't mean I can demand that people agree with what I'm saying. Indeed, many people might be very offended by what I'm saying, but that's fine. I should still be allowed to say those offensive things. And if my identity offends some people, yeah, I still have a right to have that identity. And then we might all want to have a nice, polite, friendly conversation insofar that's possible. But the deep moral thing is those fundamental rights. Now, I need to add a footnote here, of course, because I've been hanging around philosophers too long to truly believe in rights as simple as when I was a young libertarian just reading
Oh,
Friedman.
those early deontological days, they were so good, weren't they?
Oh yeah, and then you become a consequentialist and realize maybe rights are nonsense on stilts, and then you become a rule consequentialist and say actually
They're useful
rights
ones.
might be abstractions or heuristic rules, and then you sit in a few more philosophy seminars and now you don't know really what you believe anymore, but you believe it in a very wordy way.
Um, then that's the beauty of academia, of course.
Oh yeah, and sometimes the words actually mean something. Sometimes they just give you tenure or allow you to write a fun paper.
Um, okay, so we've got a few questions in chat here. If you're still good to stick around for a little. Um, Elysium asks, could you elaborate on what you mean by true self? So before you were talking about it being a narrative, but Elysium feels that with body mods, they'd be writing slash trying out narratives more than following a true self. So kind of authenticity question here.
Yeah. Uh, so I personally don't think there is a true self, but we tend to ascribe certain things to that model we have of ourselves. And that model has a lot of parts. I'm very fond of a book by Weber called The Created Self, where he argues that there are a lot of concepts, and him being an American, they all begin with C, and you can put them on a PowerPoint slide like cohesion and completeness. And you try to put them together into a self model, and they never really fit. They're always in a slight conflict and so on. But you come up with something, and then you keep on modifying that fairly complicated self model. There are going to be some parts that you actually ascribe really core value to. But you are going to say, if I change that one, I will actually lose my value, or it's going to be a different person. And some people are going to be defining that very clearly. Others are going to have a rather loose concept. And typically, when we think about authenticity, if I can play piano authentically, that means that I'm putting my emotions into the music. It's not just that I'm moving my fingers in the right way to play the right chords. It's also that it's being done for reasons that are internal to me, that has to do with my internal experience, etc. And similarly, we might say I have an authentic self in that it's self-created, that it has emerged very organically from my past, my previous selves, and so on. So I built this up. I would still argue this is a narrative, this is a story. It doesn't quite exist, but it's a model that might be actually extremely powerful in guiding what we do. How often don't we decide to say, I, I'm not going to do that because I'm not that kind of person? Or I have to do this because I'm this kind of person. in many cases, these are typically stupid things to do or don't do. Usually, this kind of argument just means that you're going to do something awful, but then feel very smug because you somehow prevented damage to your self model, which might be a mistake. After all, a lot of people in meditation and Buddhism would say, yeah, get rid of that self thing and just live, and things get so much better. And they have a point, I think. So I think upgrading your self model might be a good thing, but you want to do that again in a way that you think is acceptable. But not all changes to your life are valid changes by your own standards. And not all changes to your self model are valid by your standards, even if afterwards you might say that. So typically, you want to be careful about that core self model. I don't know if this made any sense, but it is a complex issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, and I mean, I've done a little bit of work with authenticity related to like deep brain stimulation. We did a bit of writing together, and uh, yeah, it's very difficult trying to tease out, especially as a non-philosopher. I was kind of providing the biomedical side of the work. Um, it's very difficult trying to work out like what is one's real self. You know, if I'm suffering from a neurological condition and I have a brain implant that improves that condition but has some effect that I don't want, and I switch the stimulation on, and it gives rise to this effect that changes my self, then is it authentic for me to want to switch the stimulator off or have it on? And you know, what is one's true self? Is the true self when the stimulator's on? Is it when it's off? It's all, all very difficult.
Yeah.
Um,
And you get it a lot also with antidepressants. After all,
mm,
listening to Prozac was contained this famous passage where somebody said, "Oh, when I'm on Prozac, that's a different person."
mm.
Molly Young, in her very good article about taking Adderall as a student, she said, "Adderall me was so much closer to ideal me that I wanted to be her most of the time."
Yeah, and indeed, for many people, the kind of their true self is the modified self. You know, for trans people, of course, the vast majority of them, as far as I'm aware, kind of report feeling much more their true self when they are modified from their kind of natural state. You know, the base state. I say natural, what the state that they're assigned at birth. Um, and yeah, I think you're probably right that there's no like objective, you know, platonic ideal of the sort of true self, but yeah, whether that means
It certainly feels like there is a true self a lot of the time.
it certainly does feel like it, yeah. Um, yeah, it's a difficult one, I think, but uh, though we're kind of having a whole conversation about difficult ones, that's the
Yeah.
whole point of it. Um, so next question from Neon Golden. Um, I think this an interesting one, particularly in the context of a, um, a modification, a shift in identity that doesn't easily conform to the kind of the physical reality. You know, claiming that one is an animal in some meaningful sense when one lacks fur and a tail and so on, so forth. How do you differentiate between uh, claims of identity that are in some sense legitimate and genuine mental health problems? Is
Mm.
there any like easy way you're aware of that we can kind of make this judgment?
It's tricky, but sometimes you can do it. So, for example, there are some people in the grinder subculture who want to do it yourself surgery to do various forms of body modifications and enhancers. And some of it seems to be just like normal transhumanist enhancement, and some of it seems to be weird self harm behavior. And in that domain, I think one can make a rule of thumb that if you offer that here is a nurse and a doctor who can do the thing you want to do in a hospital rather than in your kitchen,
Mm.
would you accept it? And I think that the people who say, okay, I'm happy to go to the hospital, they are not doing self-harm. They are actually trying to minimize some harm and risk. Maybe a certain degree of pain is the point, but it's not the main point. While the people say, no, I'm doing it because I'm doing it in my own kitchen, at that point, it starts becoming somewhat irrational. Similarly, you have a trepanationist movement who think that by literally drilling a hole in your cranium and allowing your brain to pulsate freely, that's going to be really good for you. I think, first of all, of course, I don't believe they're correct in their idea. They're just getting the mother of all placebo effects, the best placebo effect you could probably imagine. But should they be allowed to do it? Well, I would say, yeah, if you can do have a doctor do it and keep the instrument sterile, etc. Yeah, maybe it's kind of there on the border. It's kind of rather stupid. Now, if you imagine somebody doing something even more big, maybe having a glass ball around the brain instead, at that point, yeah, this is probably too risky. Now, when we think about changing identity and modifying bodies, when does it become escaping yourself rather than becoming more of yourself? I think that is kind of an issue. If I'm not feeling very good and then I'm hoping that surgery is going to fix things, then I might be deluding myself because I might end up modifying my appearance. This is a classic debate, of course, about plastic surgery, but you could apply it also, of course, changing species. So you could imagine some people who just constantly change species and they're always unhappy because the actual problem is inside them rather than what shape they are in. And there might be other people who just find that, yeah, I changed, but it wasn't very fun. I want to change back. I think there is a difference between them. But again, this requires good psychological understanding, both from people trying to undertake this and from the people helping them. And I do think that it behooves us to try to get better at this. In some sense, right now it's easy because it's so hard to do. So, in order to do any form of surgery to modify your body to fit your sense of self, you need to argue for it endlessly. You need to actually push very strongly. So, only the people who have a very strong view are likely to go through with it, which means that both the very sincere and the really disturbed ones are the ones doing it. And hopefully, a doctor could tell them apart. That's hopefully.
Hmm.
Now, in a world where it's very easy to do the change, it's actually not that much a big deal. It's kind of those intermediate cases that might turn out to be tricky.
Yeah, on the extreme mild end, one could ask, am I the kind of person who wears a baseball cap? And, you go out and buy a baseball cap and put it on and go, nah, doesn't work. And, you've wasted £5 or whatever it is on the baseball cap. Um, but if it requires, extreme life-threatening surgery, then we should probably have a higher threshold. Um, but yeah, it's the cases in between that get tricky. Uh,
There is probably never going to be a nice way,
mm,
a good test that makes a clear line. We're always going to have this annoying, blurry thing that is always going to be contested no matter what we do, which is annoying, but that's the way the world probably is.
yeah, yeah. Things are things are very messy. And speaking of messy, Stanley Cake Lie says, I feel like cognitive diversity is really important in the face of uncertainty about what sort of minds are utility maximizing. What's your view on that?
Yeah, I really wonder also about what maximizes utility because while I'm blessed with a very happy mind, I don't actually believe pleasure itself is the one goal. It might be instrumental. You want to be happy because you have done good, excellent things. So in general, I have a bit of fondness for a kind of Aristotelian concept that you want to live an excellent, rich life. And that involves a lot of virtues, including discovering new virtues and even making situations that allow new virtues to exist. The classical ethical virtues, for example, don't involve any environmental virtues. But now, since we become aware of ecological problems, we might say that actually sustainability might be a literal virtue. And in the not too far future, we might be developing other virtues for handling artificial intelligence or our own enhancements or living in radically different conditions. So I would say that doing these things should generate happiness. You want to maximize complexity. I have this dream about that maybe complexity is what we should be maximizing, except that all through the 90s we were trying to measure complexity and come up with good ways of defining it, and it never really worked out. We typically recognize it when we see it. That's why we kind of notice that a planet with life is very different from a planet without life. And I think the planet with life is better. But I want more kinds of life too in the universe. And going back to the original question here, I think we don't really know enough about what maximizes utility. And it might turn out that we never will know that. So we need to do a lot of hedging. That is, we need to maximize a lot of things in the hope that some of them are the truly important stuff. And for that, of course, mental diversity is going to be quite valuable.
Interesting. So, maximizing variety might in and of itself maximize utility.
Yeah, it might be on its own creative utility, but at the very least, instrumentally, we might also hedge things. Because if you have some people who are very good at being hedonists and are really enjoying themselves, and some other people who are kind of total workaholics following some Aristotelian strict morality and becoming excellent citizens and doing all that, and some others going in other directions based on some other philosophies, at least one of the groups might be onto something.
Right. Well, I think what this entire conversation has reinforced for me is that Ian M. Banks's The Culture novels are awesome and is basically the world we should be shooting for.
Yeah, I think they are unique because he actually describes a utopia that you actually might want to live in.
Oh, so
And he
much.
even managed to make interesting stories set inside the utopia.
Yeah. For those not aware, it's a great kind of uh, not super hard, but plausible space opera set in a post-scarcity sort of anarchist utopia where people change identities very rapidly and with ease and seem to enjoy it. Um, and basically, that's what I have in my mind as the utopia that we should kind of be shooting for, without getting too obsessed with that one specific instantiation. That's my kind of my internal model of a nice utopia that we want to achieve.
A lot of people think that utopia is some kind of perfection, that we should be aiming everything, and it's that single point. And I think that's a total category mistake because what you should aim at is rather going outwards, exploring, having a diversity of possibilities. Because most people find a description of your utopia as dystopia.
Mm,
It's kind of interesting that it's very hard to make a description of any utopia that is not sounding absolutely horrendous to some people, which might suggest that actually, in order to keep many people happy, we just need a very diverse world. Banks is fun because his utopia actually is very diverse, and he's having great fun in many of his novels, just giving throwaway glances about all the weird things going on in different corners of the culture. But of course, he's also contrasting the culture with the non-culture systems outside, which are definitely non-utopian. And the really interesting question also, how you get something utopian to interface with the rest of the world.
mm.
That drives a lot of drama.
It really does, and yeah, Neon Golden and everyone else who hasn't read them, highly recommended. Ian M. Banks, I'll type in chat. Uh, Highly recommended. Where would you suggest starting in the series, Anders?
I usually think Player of Games is the best
Mm,
starting point. It was the second novel he published, but consider Flebas, the first one, is probably best read after that one.
yeah,
And then,
I would tend to agree there.
yeah, my absolute favorite is Use of Weapons, which is a little masterpiece.
Ah,
Uh,
so good.
yeah. And sadly, the Ian Banks passed away a few years ago, but his final novel, The Hydrogen Sonata, is also a rather good coda for the entire suite of stories.
Yeah, it's excellent. Oh, the whole range is fantastic, but uh, Accession, I really really like the whole. Anyway, we're just going to start talking about the culture novels now, so
Yeah,
we'll.
and it's interesting because they contain a lot of good examples. So I'm writing a chapter about transhuman sex for the moment, and I've been going through Accession actually, looking a little bit at not exactly the sex scenes, but the text around them
Mm,
about how the culture goes about engineering pleasure and how people how an everyday orgasm what lasts a minute. And that's nothing to write home about, but one character is taking some risk by kind of freestyle controlling his pleasure center because he thinks that's the kind of person I am. A lot of the self definition is really important for kind of giving you style inside of this culture, where, of course, most things can be done by a super intelligent machine in a jiffy, but you want to show off that you can do it.
yeah, and that brings us back perfectly to authenticity and the importance of striking out on your own path and claiming your identity from the world. Um,
But some people also very boldly say, yeah, I'm not even going to claim my identity. I'm just going to take this nice off the shelf thing because it's so pleasurable. And I think we should recognize that's actually a valid choice and even sometimes a bold choice.
yeah, yeah. That's always something I think there's nothing wrong with just enjoying like popular culture and just like liking the nice things that are, tasty or enjoyable or fun or whatever, and you know, going with the flow as it were.
Yeah, uh, but then the fun thing is, of course, we want to discover the new things that are even better or are very different. It's a bit like food. Some people go for an exploration and try everything. Others go for exploitation. They know what they like, and then they have that dish. And I'm hoping that in the not too far future, we can also have a debate about how much exploration of your body should you have. Uh, Is it that people at school actually should try out a few different genders and body shapes just to have a bit of experience? Or is that best left as a hobby later on in life?
Yeah, interesting. And personally, I would very much like to see the technology developed where we can, um, where we can radically engineer ourselves for very low cost, because uh, a lot of the current discussion around transgender people just gets so uh, confused and so caught up on the fact that there are some risks associated with the current procedures involved with transitioning, which obviously there are with any bloody medical procedure. Um,
I think the key thing is we want to make all the medical procedures super effective,
mm,
safe, painless, etc. Because by the point we reach more full morphological freedom, before that point we have already solved medicine,
mm,
which is even more and moral important. So the project might be to sell people on the idea that actually we should be really pushing for perfecting medicine.
mm.
Yeah, as a side effect, we might turn into dragons and immortals, but it's also going to cure cancer.
And yeah, Normal Robot says, I think dragons should vote. I think dragons should be able to run for president. Dunkelzahn 2077, 2057, sorry.
Yep, yep. I totally trust Uncle Son. For those who you don't know, this is a reference to the role-playing game Shadowrun, where in the setting it's a cyberpunk game, but magic and magical creatures are returned to the world, and there is indeed a dragon that eventually runs for president of the United States.
He gets assassinated just outside Watergate Hotel, though, in mysterious
Now you're giving
circumstances.
stuff away, but
Yeah, no. Oh,
maybe not
that's
too
like
much. It
second
was a
edition.
while.
um, anyway, right. Okay, I think we'll probably wrap it up there. Um, but before we end, have you got anything you'd like to shout out? Anything you'd like to talk about or mention or whatnot?
Well, we covered a lot of ground here, so it's very hard for me, using my very limited brain, to even remember if there was anything super important that we had missed. I personally think that the, the morphological freedom is one of those things that at first sounds like, okay, that's the cherry on top of a lot of other freedoms. But it's strongly linked to many important concepts, both our ability to actually control our own bodies. We should recognize that if we can't control our bodies, we can't control who we are, and we can't actually control our lives. In fact, others get a lot of control over us, both other people, but also happenstance. And I do think it actually ties in to many of the things we care about, both in having openness towards the future, to be able to explore, but also that we probably need to work on the practical, cultural, and political basis to make it possible, both in terms of tolerance, but also in terms of getting people to accept that, yeah, we need a medical system that can allow us to change ourselves in a safe way.
Mm, absolutely. And yeah, I guess with that, I would call for everyone to, just be nice to the furries and otherkin. Like they're pioneers in a world of novel experience and self-expression. And even if they're sometimes a bit silly, just like be nice to them. It's fine. They're not harming you. Just leave them alone. Um, and yeah, thank you so much for coming on, Anders. Um, it's always a pleasure to have you. You've been on a couple of times before, talking about all kinds of interesting things, and I'll probably drop you a message next time I want to, you know, chat about something weird.
Oh, yeah, I'm always up for it. It's
Wonderful,
always fun. And yeah,
cool.
so live
Well,
long and prosper.
absolutely. Thank you very much, Anders, and you have a good evening.
Cheers.
And everyone read all of Anders' books and papers. They're genuinely great. And he's got a new book coming out sometime in the next couple of
Sometime.
years. So,
Well, it's just growing. I was just actually looking at the subsection of morphological freedom and realized actually this is a book on its own. So
ooh,
I need to finish this book so I can start on the next one.
oh, excellent. Well, if you want to come bounce some ideas around anytime, you're very welcome. Cool. All right. Thanks, Anders. Have a good evening.
Yeah,
Bye.
cheers. Thank you.
Ah, right. There we go. Um, okay. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for watching and for a really good chat. I wasn't able to follow every minute because I was having a chat with Anders, but the bits I saw seemed like you all were having an interesting conversation, and thanks for the really good questions. And yeah, I must say I'm pleased to see even that I've been getting a pretty decent viewership by my fairly modest standards these last few episodes. So thank you very much for watching. Um, Honestly, it means a lot to me that a bunch of you were, willing to sit here for an hour and a half or whatever and watch me have a chat with a friend, very interesting friend, and as is among my more interesting friends, possibly my most interesting, although don't tell my other friends. Um, and yeah, he's always good for a fascinating chat. Thanks, Matt101 Disco. I appreciate that, and yeah, I'd say my normal content is, I like to think reasonably interesting and whatnot, but my content with Anders is definitely, yeah, that's the real stuff. Right. Yeah, so I will no cocktail this evening because it was guest rather than cocktail night, but I might do a cocktail on Monday or something. Um, and yeah, I'm gonna do my best to stick with the Monday, Wednesday, Friday schedule, even though I've been a bit uh, not perfectly reliable over the last couple of weeks. My my health has been a bit shit, but I'm doing my best to stick with it. Apologies in advance if I miss the odd one. Um, I uh, I might be moving to 9 p.m. Check out my Discord. Uh, is it there we go. Check out my Discord, which is where or my Twitter down below, I think, which is where I post updates regarding like time and whatnot. Um, uh, Thank you. You take care too, Matt101. Um, yeah, so usually 8 p.m., but I don't know, I might be doing 9 p.m. soon. I'll blast it out and let folks know. But yeah, have a good evening, everyone. I'm gonna bugger off now, and I will see you on Monday if you want to pop back. So yeah, I'm not sure what I'll be discussing on Monday, but at very least I'll do a politicsy, you know, arguing with you all about conquest of bread and whatnot. Um, yeah, right. Ta ta. Have a good night and enjoy your weekend.